I am disappointed in the state that our nation has come to. Our national debt is mounting at an ever-increasing rate, and we are meeting the multi-trillion-dollar debt ceilings faster than we can raise it. Americans toil at their jobs in fear that they will lose them, and salute their fallen workless colleagues. However, we have nothing to fear, for I will once again shoulder the burden of carrying the nation out of depression. As president, I have undergone a baptism by fire. I assumed the presidency after the stock market crash of 1929, which catapulted the nation, nay world, into a universal depression. $10 billion gone, and yet through it all, I was able to lead our nation out of the Great Depression, and we made it through together. I led our nation through the Second World War. Mothers lost their sons, sisters lost their brothers, wives lost their husbands, men lost their lives. The wars in Middle East pale in comparison. From October 1929 to August 1945, our nation suffered. Our soldiers suffered. Our citizens suffered. Our children suffered. We suffered. Now today we are experiencing threats to our peace and the democracy which created it. I cannot stand to see our nation fall to its knees again. I will not stand to see our nation fall to its knees again. I will ensure the safety and security of this nation. I will be the president needed to unite and lead our nation to be the best it can be. Our nation will be the best under me, Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Who was Franklin Delano Roosevelt? Roosevelt was many things. He was the Commander-in-Chief of the United States Armed Forces. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt was able to use more direct means to deal with the surrounding war. He adopted the Europe First strategy, recognizing that Germany was a greater threat than Japan. And to win the war at home, Roosevelt organized the Mobilization Front with several actions. Among them the Selective Service Act of 1940, the War Production Board, and the National War Labor Board. The Selective Service Act was the first peacetime military draft, and the WPB managed government business cooperation with generous incentives, and the National War Labor Board arbitrated disputes between labor and management. Even before the United States entered the war as an official combatant, Roosevelt passed the Selective Service Act to prime the Army for the impending war. Despite Roosevelt's New Deal stance on business, for the duration he compromised, meeting business more than halfway by paying for expensive retooling and factory expansions, giving antitrust exemptions, and giving generous tax write-offs. As for the NWLB, Roosevelt was able to create a compromise on the issue of open and closed shops. Yet he did not hesitate to use force when any activities hindered the war effort, as the United Mine Workers strikes did. He was the chief proponent of the war effort. He established the Office of Price Administration to ration goods with the system of blue and red points under the Emergency Price Control Act. Under the system, each person received 48 blue points and 64 red points to purchase consumable goods. To bolster supplies for the war, Roosevelt led the people in encouraging everybody to contribute to the war effort. Families grew victory gardens to help free up food supplies. Women turned in leftover cooking fat to be used in making glycerin, an ingredient in gunpowder. Even children contributed to the war, scrounging up scraps of metal to be used in grenades or ships. He was also an uncompromising man on the issue of national security. Post-Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt took no risks with the West Coast Japanese residing in the United States, containing them in internment camps to protect their domestic tranquility with preventative security measures in the form of Executive Order 3066. Fearful of the American Japanese undermining the war effort, he was forced to relegate them to internment camps on the basis of race rather than by individual actions. He was a representative of the United States when discussing the strategy for the war. He located funding for programs like the code-breaking MAGIC program, which greatly contributed to the U.S. victory at the Battle of Midway. This became a crucial turning point in the war, putting Japan on the defensive and the United States on the offensive. In the meetings with Churchill and Stalin, Roosevelt sided with Churchill in deciding to invade peripheral territories rather than opening a second front as Stalin suggested, in order to assure early victories to maintain high morale.
Roosevelt also enacted a scientific research program funded by the government known as the Manhattan Project. In 1939, Roosevelt, convinced that Germany was creating their own nuclear weapons, decided to fund this project in order for the United States to develop an atomic weapon. This created the world's first controlled nuclear chain reaction, which resulted in the atomic bomb. This program proved successful, as it was used to force Japan into an unconditional surrender. FDR also enacted acts and founded organizations to support the war effort. The Office of War Information worked towards consolidating the current government information services and creating a new, reliable way to relay information from abroad to the ears of Americans sitting at home. They created propaganda and posters to create a positive perception of the war. He was also the founder of the War Refugee Board, which had a significant impact on the power that the U.S. had to deal with the influx of people fleeing the Axis powers in Germany. Many of these people were coming to America in seek of refuge, and the War Refugee Board helped in saving over 200,000 Jews and others from being suppressed. Because of the significant dependence on the production front, FDR created the War Labor Disputes Act, also known as the Smith-Connolly Act. This gave him the executive authority to seize and conduct any working plant that was crucial to national defense or security if there was a strike or lockout. The government had the authority to seize this production plant if the workers went on strike, as long as it was crucial to national security. Former President Roosevelt was also present at multiple international conferences among leaders from other countries, including Great Britain and the Soviet Union. This included the Tehran Conference, which took place on November 28, 1943. This conference took place in Iran and was composed of the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and the Soviet leader Joseph Stalin. These three leaders discussed strategies for winning the war and terms for peace at the conclusion of the war. At this conference, a major Allied strategy known as Operation Overlord was discussed. This plan was executed on June 6th in the year 1944 on the shores of Normandy, where the Allied forces launched a major invasion of Western Europe. Over 400,000 soldiers died on D-Day, but the victory was one that largely contributed to the Allies' victory at the end of the war. As you can see, former President Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a successful and influential figure in this nation's history, and he has the innate potential to lead us through the conflicts we are currently undergoing.
Welcome to tonight's broadcast. Recently, I interviewed the newest candidate to the 2016 presidential campaign. He's from the past, and if he wins, this will be his 5th term as president. I don't know how that works, but tonight, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So, Mr. Roosevelt, many things have happened since you were last president. Since then, how do you think the remaining of the many programs and legislations that you enacted are working or should have been continued?
Well, I believe that back when I was president during the Great Depression and the Second World War, there were many things like Social Security and Medicare that has grown a lot since I've been president. Since I've been president. And things like Obamacare, Medicare, and Social Security has grown, and they're all steps in the right direction. And I feel as president, I will be able to continue with this growth in a positive direction.
Okay. Speaking of growth and economy, how do you plan to levy taxes when you take presidency?
Well, truthfully, I still believe in a graduated income tax, and that was during the Second World War. The graduated income tax was also enacted, and it was actually as much as 94% on the top 5% of wealth in the entire nation.
So you plan to put 94% on top 5% of today's nation?
Definitely not. I believe that although the graduated income tax should be implemented, it should definitely be mellowed down to a good percentage.
Now, during World War II, there was a massive redistribution of wealth from the rich to the poor and middle class. In today's society, how do you plan to redistribute the wealth in the same fashion?
Well, as I had talked about taxing and how I plan to use the graduated income tax that I had used in the Second World War, I believe that redistributing the wealth will create a new middle class that will spend more and boost our economy to heights that it's never seen. I plan on doing this with stipulations such as the graduated income tax.
What are your opinions and policies on labor?
Well, during the Second World War, I had needed the corporations to, build the weaponry needed to win the war. With this, there were many unions who believed that they were getting the short side of the stick, and so they thought that by striking they might get, better things. And I still believe that production is needed and it should not be disrupted or interrupted. So in terms of labor unions, I believe that they're great, but I feel that in terms of striking, they should, be careful about, the essential jobs that are needed to run this nation should not be able to go on strike.
Unlike other Democratic candidates, Mr. Roosevelt does not advocate the breaking up of big banks and instead advocates the cooperation with them. Here's his take on banks.
I believe that working alongside banks will not only help the economy, but also boost the citizens' trust in the banks. So as I had done during the Great Depression, I had also actually enacted a bank holiday. Pretty much shut down all of the banks, and the ones that were running well, I started up again, and the ones that needed a little help, I helped them. And together, the government and the banks were able to make a better economy. And I feel that working alongside the banks will also do the same for the economy in this era.
I was curious whether Mr. Roosevelt's opinions on foreign policy had changed throughout the years. Here's his take on foreign policy. Now, a lot has happened in foreign policy as well. Starting with, how do you plan to ease tensions we have with other nations, such as Russia?
Well, back in World War II, when I was president, we definitely had some great relations with Russia. I believe that Russia's tensions occurred between the lack of communication between our two countries. And during the Second World War, although we obviously didn't share everything with them, we did have a mutual understanding of what was happening and what was going to happen. But now that these communications have been severed, the tensions have been increased and aggravated. So, in terms of communication, I believe that if we understand what's happening in their nation and what's happening in our nation, maybe we'll be able to help each other and make both nations better.
Many times, Mr. Roosevelt reflects upon his past to inform his decision about present-day policies. However, the past is very different from the present-day issues, and here's his take on immigration. Now, when you were president in World War II, you turned down many Jews seeking refuge in the United States from the Holocaust from Adolf Hitler, especially turning down the ship called the St. Louis, do you recall? Full of Jewish refugees that were trying to escape persecution from Hitler. And eventually they were forced to go back to Europe, and many of them did die to Adolf Hitler's death camps and military. So in a similar fashion, Syrian refugees are trying to escape Syria from ISIS and terrorists and the civil war that is occurring there. Do you plan to enforce the same strictness on immigration as you did during World War II in today's time?
Yes, I believe that although refusing the Jews from landing here, it's not like I didn't help them. I did create the War Refugee Board, which provided help in Europe itself. So what I plan to do in Syria is to not instigate an immigration from Syria to the United States, but rather create maybe another board that will help Syrians in Syria.
So, what is your stance on the influx of Syrian refugees into the United States?
I feel that it is much, and it maybe should be controlled. I feel that this incoming of the United States isn't doing the best for our economy. And I feel that what Syrians are trying to escape doesn't have to be cured by coming to the U.S. I feel that it can be cured by staying in Syria just with the help. So I believe that while staying in Syria, leaving the tensions of traveling across seas and leaving family behind should not have to occur. And so I plan to help them there.
So do you plan to get right into Syria, and what do you plan to do in Syria to help these refugees, these innocent people?
Well, like in the Second World War, when I had created the War Refugee Board, it created small, you can almost call them camps, in which Jewish people could come and stay there, and pretty much they would be safe almost. It wouldn't be in Germany, we'd be in other places surrounding it, not too far, just so that they could be safe.
With the recent attacks in Paris and the influx of terrorism around the world, I wanted to see what Mr. Roosevelt thought of terrorism, as he never fully experienced it to the degree of which we experience terrorism today. Here's Mr. Roosevelt's take on terrorism. How do you plan to combat the growing movement of terrorism while you have no experience with it?
Well, as I am deeply saddened by terrorism and I am confused as its roots, I've noticed or taken note of different ways presidents have combated. One thing that President Bush did was create the U.S. Patriot Act, and I thought that worked very well. Although I believe that, like in the Second World War, the safeness of communities and the safeness of our citizens rely on information being shared with the citizens. This could be seen as talking through the radio. I had a fireside chat with all the citizens who had radios, and I was able to communicate with them and lessen their fear. In terms of dealing with terrorism, I believe that the Patriot Act did its job, and I believe that funding the Patriot Act and expanding it will help our nation against the fight for terrorism.
And that was the newest candidate to the 2016 presidential campaign. Thank you for watching tonight's broadcast. I'm Charlie Rose, and good night.
My name is Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and I want you to vote for me for the 2016 election, and I approve of this message.